Alright guys, welcome to another highs and lows breakdown of the pound Japanese yen. Starting on the weekly time frame, I've established the last week's high. Last week's high came in at 135.92 and last week's low came in at 134.02, basically 134 flat. Um, Over these past 2 weeks, we've seen some strong bullish price action on the pound, which suggests that we may see some bullish continued price action into this week. Not also being cognizant of the fact that this week's the weekly candle, because the other two have been so bullish, we could see a doji candle formed as some ranging begins to take place as we begin to prepare for the next bullish leg up. Conversely, we could retest the highs from last week and get some sells down into the week, but we just play day by day to see how to see what price action, what opportunities price action presents for us. Dropping down to the daily time frame, I've established Friday's high coming in at 135.20 and Friday's low coming in at 134.28. We need to be cognizant that we are still in an uptrend on the pound, so I'm more inclined for buys. But if the opportunity presents itself for sells, we would not hesitate and we will pull that trigger. So if we could break above Friday's high and get some support around this region, we could see buys up to retest last week's high. Of which we make a decision based on the price action we see around these areas, whether it could break up for continuous buys or get some resistance around this area and sell down for the latter part of this week. A break below last week's low, we could see sells down into 133, which is a 100 pip range down. But keeping in mind we are still in an uptrend. I'll drop down to the forward time frame. See, we caught buys around these areas last week and at a retest of this zone. So I know that a lot of y'all benefited from those trades from last week. We saw a strong sell-off after we touched last week's high at 135.90. This strong bearish price action suggests to me that we could see some more downward momentum, as this could be a break and a retest of this trend line. But until we break below Friday's low, I'm still going to maintain my bullish bias. So if we could break above Friday's high, get some support along this region, see some bullish price action, we could get buys up into last week's high, and that would be a range of 70 pips up. Conversely, if we see some resistance formed at around 135.20, we could get some sells down. But as I mentioned before, my bias is bullish, but I would prepare for anything. If we I mentioned if we break below last week's low, we could ride down into 133 flat. I think we're basically at a crossroads where we could see any one of the two things, but we just need to wait and sit on our hands to see what does price action tell us. Heading into Euro Japanese yen, let's start with the weekly time frame. Now on the weekly time frame, like I mentioned in last week's and the video from the week before, we have broken out of this downtrend on Euro Japanese yen. We've broken above, retest this zone, of which we could see buys up for the rest of the year potentially. What we do, I still maintain that once we stay above 119.50, we could maintain buys up at my bullish bias holds once we maintain above 119.50. On the weekly time frame, we had a high last week coming in at 121.99, basically 122 flat, and we have a low last week coming in at 120.24. If I drop down to the daily time frame, on the daily time frame, we had Friday's high coming in at 121.07 and Friday's low was basically last week's low. What I would like to see this week, if we could break above Friday's high. Now, the problem is This week, if the Euro Japanese yen were to be bearish, we could see a retest of last week's high, or even a 50% retracement at around 121.50 for sells down for the latter part of the week. If we break above last week's high, that would be a strong bullish sign for me. So if we could break above last week's high, get some support at around 122 flat, we could see buys. That's clear buys straight up into 124. That's 200 pips from last week's high. Conversely, if we break below last week's low, I'd be looking for sells down into the next region at approximately 118 flat. So it depends on your risk appetite, but me personally on this pair, if I would sit on my hands until I break above last week's high and get some support to catch buys up 200 pips, or I would wait for us to break below last week's low, get some resistance at last week's low to get sells down into 118 flat. Well, the first level I need to break is 119.50 and then 118 flat. So we'll see how that goes, right? Dropping down into the forward time frame just to get an idea of the price action we see on the low smaller time frames on this pair. Yeah, if I draw a neat little quick trend line here, yeah, we potentially have broken this bullish trend line and coming up to retest it now to see sells later on. If we break back above the trend line and then above last week's high, like I mentioned before, we see buys into 124. Trying to keep this as concise as possible. If I check the pound USD, let's check it on the weekly time frame. On the weekly time frame, we have a high coming in at 1.2670 and a last week's low coming in at 124.60. If you look at the pound USD has been a lot more bullish than the pound Japanese yen. That's because there's been some weakening in the US dollar. Firstly, my bullish bias remains the same on this pair. If we could get a retest of Friday's low, we could get some buys to form a new high. If we look at this price action on the weekly time frame, and I mean, if we drop down to the daily time frame, I think the price action is a bit more clearer. Yes, it is. We formed a high at 1.1482. I mean, sorry, not a high, my apologies. We formed a low at 1.4, basically 1.1430. Then we formed a high at this region. Then we formed a higher low because it's higher than this previous low. Then we formed a higher high at 12800, and then we formed a higher low around this region here. Potentially what we're currently doing is forming a higher high. We're in the process of forming a higher high, so we could see a higher high, and once we break above 128, it's clear buys all the way up into 3120 approximately. Conversely, because if you look at this region here, this is a strong sellers region at around 1.2669 if we judge from this previous price action, which we are currently at. So we could see sells down, so what I'm basically trying to say is that this week it's very integral to look at price action in terms of we're at a peculiar place in all pairs that I've looked at so far, in that we could see some bullish price action or we could see some bearish price action. While I'm still bullish on the pound, I would be cautious at around these regions. A break above last week's high, clear sells up. If we break below last week's low, that'd be a sign for me that we're coming down to retest the previous week's low at 22.96. Which if we could find some support here, we could have formed a double bottom for buys up. A break below this region, strong sellers action down into these lows. If I go to Euro USD, what I would like to do is just glance across into last week's chart. We're looking at Euro USD on the forward time frame here. Last week, what I mentioned is that price was converging into a point. They call this a pennant, right? And what I was saying is that if we could break above this downtrend line, I'd be looking for a retest at around the trend line to catch buys up. If you took this trade with us, you would have been up 60 pips on the first leg. We came back down and retested the trend line again, and we saw some bullish price action. You can see a doji candle and a strong bullish reversal candle. If we caught buys up, that was 100 pips. We should have been up at least 100 pips on this pair alone. Then we came back down. We tested the downtrend line again, and we're currently pushing up. What would be nice this week is if we could retest this zone and form like a head and shoulders, this being the left shoulder, this being the head, and if we could come up and get some resistance at around this region for right shoulder, we could see some sells down if the US dollar strengthens. Things that will strengthen the US dollar, if we get another round of stimulus checks coming into the economy, pumping more money into the economy, we could see the US dollar gain some strength. If we get some news about coronavirus relief in the US dollar, in the United States, we could get some US dollar strength. So just things to note. If I glance across our chart for this week now, we go on a weekly time frame. Last week we formed a high at 113.71 and a low at 112.60 approximately, right? If I drop down to the daily time frame, you can see the last day's candle was a bit of a doji on indecision candle. But if we could remain above Friday's low, I think we could maintain our bullish bias to retest the highs of last week. I dropped down to the forward time frame. You could see this a bit better. See, we stuck within this range currently. If we push up, as I mentioned before, and form a head and shoulders, we could get some sells down. But for me, a break above Friday of last week's high would be a strong indication of some bullish momentum coming into the market. Firstly, for buys up into 1422, and secondly, a buys to retest these highs up here at 1490. A break below last week's low, we could see some sells down first, retest 1170, and then potentially down into the 1.100 region. I hope this was helpful for you guys. As I mentioned before, this week is a kind of tricky week for me, given the kind of price action. I see a lot of dojis in the market currently, so we could see this week present itself as a doji candle, which would be like a consolidation period for some further price action later on in the week or next week. So basically, I think I would definitely give you guys an update on Wednesday for midweek update. I just noticed here we have a kind of, if I draw a best fit line there, we're still in an uptrend on Euro USD. So until we get some more fundamental news, that I still favor buys on this pair. But that being said, Wednesday expect a weekly update, because I think I need to see a little more price action at the start of the week for me to solidify my bias for later on in the week, guys. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you guys next week. And well, before next week, I'll see you guys for the midweek update. Enjoy.